Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope today's a good weather day for you. Going to be talking about providing feedback in online courses. A little bit about my background. I am an industrial organizational psychologist by education, and I have been teaching online for about 4 years and also have been doing some teaching on ground. So the goals of this session today are to review some of the basic principles of feedback from applied and research perspectives, discuss strategies for delivering feedback, discuss feedback effectiveness, and a little bit about peer feedback. As a preview to some of the topics I'll be going into more depth on in the future. Okay, so why provide feedback? What's the point of this, exercise? I mean, first off, it's one of those essential things that will let a student know if they failed or passed or got an A or a different grade in the class. But besides from that, practical perspective, there are also some, theoretical or academic reasons for growth that need to be addressed when providing feedback. For example, feedback is essential for student growth and learning. Someone won't be able to improve or understand how to improve without knowing how they're doing. The things that get measured get improved upon. Feedback can also provide direction to the student and help to boost confidence of their level of mastery of the content. It also will help to increase motivation of the student to continue to do well on the classes and within the course, and also help to build their self-esteem. And it can prevent a student from making inappropriate comparisons to maybe the smartest person in the class or the most senior person, because they have feedback from the professor that they can use to kind of compare with their own current standing. There are some benefits to the instructor as well, so it's not necessarily all about the student, but it is also the instructor can benefit. For instance, by providing feedback, you are able to promote your own personal and professional growth. You can enhance your own communication skills, and you can get a sense of personal satisfaction through seeing progress of the student develop through the material and course. And a lot of times it may just be for one class that you're providing feedback to the student, but in other times you may develop a relationship with that student that will continue for another class or two, or maybe you'll see that student again in one of your more advanced classes. Okay, so a little bit about excuse me. What are some of the other benefits that providing feedback might bring to either you, the instructor, or to the students? And I guess you can just type in the text chat box. Right, good. It can help to clarify the points you've made, points about the assignment. Help answer questions, right? Right. It also allows students to edit work in progress. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. As in some assignments you might have an ongoing assignment where it might be a paper and there are one or two drafts before the final version of the paper. In other classes, you may just have a series of, one-time exercises or assignments that might build from one another. Okay, so a little bit about what feedback is. Definition-wise is a response that provides information back to the student or evaluates some action or process that the student undertook. It helps to explain what needs to be done and why. It can be a formative assessment to give information to the student and as well as the teacher about how well the student is doing in meeting the classroom goals. Feedback is useful for the teacher because it helps the teacher know where the student is developing expertise or needs assistance. You can see this through, each initial assignment or the ongoing relationship you have with the student over the period of the course time. It's also helpful for the student to know what they know currently in relation to what the stated goals of the course are and how to advance in those goals. There are two types of feedback. One is to just kind of provide information about the mistakes to the student so they know what was correct or incorrect, and another type of feedback will help the student know how to improve their scores in the future. In terms of knowing where a student stands in relation to the learning goals, a grade of 70% out of 100 provides some information. It's more a descriptive number that students can relate to. One thing that might be useful is, and we'll talk about this later, is comparing different parts of the course, the first half and the second half, to know if it's effective. Okay, and I guess the next slide is a general question, is whether you see feedback as something to be done after teaching or after an assignment is due, or is it central to the learning process itself? Okay, so I see a lot of people saying both. There are a few people saying it's really about the learning process, which is good because it can be easy to get into that point of view that the assignment is where the feedback is really focused on, and then it's up to the student to kind of deal with it then. But it's also think about providing this feedback as helpful to the student so that they can improve, they can identify their problem areas and make corrections and changes. And it's also valuable to you as an instructor because when the student completes the course evaluation form, that may be something they think about. And did the professor just provide comments about what was correct, or some brief notes about what went well or what didn't well, or did that professor really help them see how to improve, and they could actually grasp that concept and make changes. So being able to help students see how this feedback is valuable is also very important, for your own evaluation as teaching the course as well. Okay. So feedback also, I'll note, is something that is supporting learning, and how it does this comes from a few different ways. So it will be an incentive to increase your responses and accuracy of those responses. So if you have a session, class where you have participation or discussion requirements, providing feedback on how well the student is doing can encourage students to increase their participation to make the standard goals for the course. Oh. And it can also help to increase the accuracy of those responses so the student knows what's correct or and how to improve.
Okay, so David, it sounds like Jean has a question and she'd like to take the mic. So why don't we let her ask her question for a second?
Thank you, Sandra and David. I just wanted to, David, bring up a point because this is very, very important, I think, what you're talking about right here. I just completed a course. I'm actually getting my online MBA as we speak, and I just completed a finance course that in the beginning of the class, when you introduce yourselves, of course, they ask the question, the instructor asks the question, what's your background and what's your comfort level with the material and that kind of thing. And most of the class, probably 90% of us said, we're terrified, we don't know this stuff, this isn't our area of expertise. So, based on that initial feedback, I guess I expected that they'd make some changes to make sure that we would understand the material, or if we had questions or problems with the materials, there'd be some way that we could get extra help or at least talk to somebody about it. I found that by about 3/4 of the way through the course, I was so frustrated and didn't learn anything that I had to call the administrator's office and basically say, this isn't working for me. You've got to change the format of this course because, and come to find out he'd had a lot of other complaints. So I think it would have been very helpful taking that information from the beginning and kind of gearing that and saying, okay, well, how can we maybe give you more instruction? And then they ended up giving us more instruction and giving us more materials and things that helped us to learn what we should have learned in the first place. So I can't stress enough how important this is.
Okay, that is a great point. That very basic course overview, some of the questions really come into play. They help to define the roles and expectations and policies. I'm going to, in the upcoming course, I'm going to be talking about 4 different types of feedback: informational, instructional, corrective, and appreciative. And what you were talking about kind of fits in with the informational feedback type of information, where you provide facts or news or updates, things like asking students if they have the books or materials downloaded or available, welcome announcements, reviewing course policies about grading late assignments or teams. These are things that help to set the groundwork for the class. Kind of a basic step is just making sure that everybody understands, how the class is going to be run and address any questions about those procedures. So that's one of those very, central elements of feedback.
David, Patty has a comment in that text box which is pretty interesting. She also mentions how you give meaningful feedback for 15 weeks, 25 or 30 students as well.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. When you have a high volume of a lot of students for a long period of time, in some ways I think you can develop the feedback and the personal relationship with those students more effectively with a 15-week course than you can with maybe a 5-week or 6-week class. You can have a better chance of getting to know what the student is doing, how well they're doing, where they know how well they're improving. The other thing to note is, with a lot of students, it can be helpful to think about how you're going to manage all of that, the course assignments. And there are different ways to do this. Maybe some people can make mental notes on the students that stand out, but in the long run, that may not be the most effective thing. If you have a lot of classes or a lot of students, it's easy to forget something specific that the student said. Using some standard grading rubrics can also be a great help as well.
So David, there's a lot of conversation on this topic going on in the text box. Jean has a comment where she's saying that some sort of open forum for ongoing questions and issues to be addressed is a good idea. Jim notes that feedback to many kids can be very overwhelming. Patty says she gets tired of trying to think of ways to say good work, so some creative thinking there can be helpful. Sounds like Patty has like 32 folks in each section. And then Catherine notes to Patty's comment there that it's important to help to learn to give appropriate and meaningful feedback to their peers, like a checklist with draft of written assignments. Patty then goes on to note that some drop, but not many from a class of her size. Jim also then notes that he tries to get students to interact and give each other feedback. And then Jean's talking about a discussion for questions and concerns by students, and Patty likes to use that method as well. And then one feedback per student for weekly discussion posts from Jean. Then Catherine talks about the rubrics like you did, like using rubrics and teaching how to use them so that they have a roadmap before they do an assignment, and perhaps even use the rubric to grade a sample assignment, which is not, and then Jim says it's not always enough. And then Seton Hall University talks about canning some comments like citation practices, spelling, grammar, and then adding specifics about student works. Patty agrees with using rubrics and an Ask the Professor section. So canned responses are fine from Jean's perspective as long as students know how they're doing. And for larger projects, it's best to have more personalized feedback for large type feedback. Catherine notes that specific feedback is more helpful than general, and writing maybe a great thesis statement or good detailed support rather than just good job. And I believe Jim talked a little bit earlier about having them do student peer feedback, and he grades based on the feedback that they give. And they get grades for responding to feedback. So those are some of the comments from your thoughts, David. I don't know if you wanted to talk any more about anything they've shared with us.
Okay, wow, what great suggestions. Thanks for speaking up on those issues. I think the open forum for questions is very important. Maybe there's a place where students know they can post a question about the course procedures that might be related to everyone. If an assignment description was not entirely clear, if the reading wasn't, the link to the reading didn't work, that might be the place where they can voice that question, or it could be answered by the faculty. And there's also student-oriented question centers that may, if you have an individual forum for students, you might want to post a notice or a thread that kind of leaves open the lines of communication for them to kind of talk with you. Right, and the issue of having to say good job all the time, I think it just may depend on the type of assignment. If it's the more basic or assignment may not need as much feedback, detailed or person-specific feedback, and saying good work might be okay. Certainly using some of the common phrases, if you're grading grammar, to say the grammar went well might be helpful. But there are also times when you do need to personalize the feedback to make it more student-centric. And it seems like the students with more difficulties having grasping or understanding the material tend to get more feedback, while the students that are doing very well in the course may sometimes not get as much feedback. and so that can sometimes be a challenge because you don't necessarily want the people that are doing the best in the class not to really have anything more said to them than, good job, keep up the great work. You want to be able to, take that person who's really in the top 10% or of the class and provide useful feedback to them as well. So that can be a little bit more of a unique challenge in structuring the feedback. And I also think that the peer feedback is really helpful, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But there's so much a student can learn from seeing one another's feedback that may not always be captured by what the faculty state.
So Patty has some comments that one of the things that she's trying to consider doing, David, is a 2-week discussion. So the first week the students would do initial responses, and the second week would be responses from the peers. And Jim notes to that that's a real constructivist thing, and Jean also liked that. And so Jim really tries to create a community of learners, one in which he's a part of that community, not the only part. And Catherine was wondering from others, how many number of posts do you require for students to have feedback to other posting? And it can definitely be an overwhelming thing. So Patty teaches as an adjunct with 32 students, and she has a full-time job in addition to that. So it's trying to provide good feedback in a time constraint kind of thing. And Jim really needs to figure something out because he's teaching 5 sections this September or he'll die. So Catherine then talks about feedback between each other, some that you don't see, teaching writing online to make it more manageable and give lots of guidance for feedback. And so those are some really great points and feedback there. And just some of my experience, there's a great program called Type It In where you can type comments with some general ones and fit that in. And one of the schools that I work in has a program where you can manually choose some comments that they've sort of put in for some writing feedback and some formatting feedback, and those are helpful. But if there's certain types of feedback for assignments, sometimes I just start like a Word file if it's a class that I teach over and over, so I can kind of cut and paste and sort of put those in. So it's the same ideas, but I kind of structure them specific to the student. So I'm going to turn it back over to David.
Okay, great comments and thoughts. So I know the workload that you came up, and one thing that I find helpful or has been suggested, is coming up with standard grading comments or grading rubrics that can be used. As Sandra mentioned, this Type It In software. I know it's also helpful to maybe try to use the autocorrect function on Word. So maybe you type in a comment that is F1. You type in F1, and Word will replace that with a specific comment, such as revise this section to be more succinct. That may just appear on the paper itself. You can also do this with grading rubrics where maybe you need to state a common improvement statement. You don't necessarily want to have to type it out every time. So using something like a macro or one of those autocorrect functions in Word might be helpful. Are there other options? The other thing to note is using track changes. If it's a longer text-based document, can be helpful. Or making comments, annotations are also helpful. I tend to find the annotations more helpful when making bigger point ideas, such as make sure to explain more detail about this topic, and maybe just making some grammar changes using track changes in the document. Are there other software tools or tips people like to use that might help kind of speed up the process of giving feedback, or maybe not to speed up, but things that may make your life a little bit easier?
So David, Jean makes a comment from a student perspective where she is busy with a full-time job on top of school. She doesn't want extra feedback. As long as she knows by the grading that she's doing well, she only needs canned grades each week and looks more for feedback on assignments. Whereas Jim then comes back and says that he agrees, but some students need more direction than just simple things. And Patty is saying, I wonder whether I should ask each student at the beginning of the semester what kind of feedback they'd like and expect. And then Jean's like, yes, and that's where the feedback should be focused. And then there's some programs to make verbal comments to record them, so it's quicker than writing it all out. And Catherine, I think there's a program, Dragon Naturally Speaking, that's something like that. There's probably a lot more. And Patty also notes that some instructors use audio feedback, and VoiceThread would be one of those. And it just tries to help with some of those overloading issues. Audio can be easier and faster, Jim notes. And Patty's been making videos about general feedbacks or topics that can be covered better than writing. And the thread is good for, voice threads are good for individuals. Jim just notes that he deals with high school kids. Younger kids need more stroking, and entry-level students need more feedback as well. Right, Catherine. Dragon Naturally Speaking is voice thread recognition software. When you get it, you train it to your voice, and it will type in something. And it's fairly accurate when you're using it. Sometimes you do need to kind of do some proofreading and fixing based on what words you're asking it. But it's definitely a good product to use. And Jean is also saying that, yes, the age thing is a factor for sure. I can personally say that from a feedback perspective, the clearer you are and the more direction that you provide, I think the instructions for an assignment or for participation, like we're talking about answering questions, is very important based on what you ask them to do, and then the feedback that you give should match clearly. So if you ask them to make, say, 2 posts 4 days a week, the feedback should focus clearly on what you're asking, as well as if there's areas for improvement, those things need to be noted as well. So even though they're doing a good job, I think it's important that they know what they're doing well. And Patty also agrees being clear up front and consistently revising instructions based on experiences from previous semesters. And Catherine saying, like a general comment, the class is working on S, X, and making progress in Y, but could use more review on Z. Let's review that next session. And Catherine, that's a great point, because I have an assignment laid out, but then when I start threads online, I put specific, like, hey, the directions are listed above, but please make sure that you focus on these type of things. That's what's specifically going to be graded. And then I do love to do the wrap-up at the end, because I feel like it's important, because maybe everyone hasn't read everyone else's comments. But I do think it's important in addition to the individual feedback, because I don't do sort of a, this isn't right in the public forum, but kind of try and give more praise to continue on. Jean notes that it's important to have clear and simple instructions to follow, and that helps out a lot. Yes, Nadine, that's right. Poor David's got all these slides, and I'm sure that he's loving me entertaining and giving my feedback here, because it is tough to kind of monitor and go through a presentation at the same time. And Patty also notes that some general feedback is also useful too. And open-ended questions tend to defy much structure, so you want to point people in the right direction and not draw a map. So I think you've got through the comments right now. Continue to keep chatting, and I'm going to turn it back over to David.
Okay, thank you. I noticed, some people commented on the Dragon software. I have this program as well. I haven't used it for giving feedback directly. That's certainly an interesting idea. I think it also just kind of depends on your own preference. What makes it easy for you? Is it easier to type your feedback in, or is it easier to vocalize it? In cases where you have more specific or nuanced feedback, it may make sense to use some kind of voice program. The option of a video is also very intriguing. I've not explored that, but that may be something that may become more common in some of the more advanced classes. The other thing I wanted to note was, giving the class comments on, this is where the class is, and here's how they are doing. I think that can be helpful to review. I find that has been helpful for me when maybe there's one section, if it's a grammar exercise and one of the questions tends to get incorrectly answered by a lot of the people, it may be helpful to kind of review that point for everyone. Even the people who got the answer correct may benefit from the discussion of what the correct answer is. So students know that they're not necessarily the only one having challenges with this particular item. So I think we've talked a little bit about a lot of the content, but the principles of feedback or good feedback will consider the need of the audience. And we talked, and someone had mentioned the difference between students beginning in the very early part of the course. If it's a very basic class, they may need more feedback that would be instructional, things that help them to coach or encourage their knowledge development, asking probing questions that can be discussed openly, things that will help students think about the current knowledge and how it might be applied, where a more senior student or a higher advanced class might, the feedback may focus more on providing more detailed comments or helping them to try to make the deeper connections between multiple concepts from the current course and prior classes. The purpose of the feedback, the second bullet, is to, we can think about it as reviewing the assignment or how well they did in more detail, and how it should be delivered depends on the level of objective of the course. Is it just a basic course? Is it a math course? Is it a expert mastery class? And feedback should also be clear, and this is important because it should be understood by both parties, because what you say or communicate may not necessarily be what the student hears and understands. So just because you say you need to work on improving the paragraph structure in this one place, if it was a minor comment, the student may perceive it to be a much bigger problem issue. So it's important to try to make sure that the student also understands or tries to have the same level of understanding of feedback that you're providing. And feedback should help to explain what can be done. If you say the answer is incorrect or not enough information has been provided on the methodology, it's more helpful as a reviewer to provide feedback that is instructive. It will let the learner know how they can do a better job in addressing this issue next time. So it's not that this section was not just saying the methodology was not described well. It's stating describe the analysis plan in more detail. So the more specific or actionable feedback that will help explain or guide the student in what changes to make can be especially helpful.
So David, there's just a few more comments in the box. Patty's noting that flip cameras are cheap and easy for making videos, and they are fairly easy. And then Jim notes off of that is that visual stuff is a nice rest from reading from text, especially if they're online textbooks. And Patty talks about just trying to cover many learning styles so that no one feels left out, that it's hard to get through the material. And then Erna is, what do you think of the use of tentative language and feedback to college students? For example, you may want to consider. And Jim talks about trying to avoid being the expert in his classes. And it really depends upon what you want to accomplish. If they've totally missed it, then it would be more direct. If they just failed to consider another alternative, then Patty goes with trying to use it. And Jean's talking about saying she thinks the more specific, the better if there's something a student is not doing right or well. And to start the feedback with statements with like points to consider.
So in terms of the visual or the audio feedback, that can be useful. I've not seen that done, but I think I would like to hear a little bit more about that, or I may try to see what that actually looks like. It seems like it might it seems like most students would be able to open an audio video file or a multimedia file from their computer. I think it's probably helpful when giving more feedback, just because sometimes we feel, we're not able to see the students or communicate with them directly. Having that little personal connection might also go a long way with not only the student feeling, learning how to improve, but also feeling more connected to the classroom, the professor, and the university. So instead of getting some email from the anonymous a person who's sitting at the other side of the screen miles away, they're getting to see who that person is, and getting to know them, or at least get a sense of how the feedback is being delivered. It's probably helpful to build relationships with students, help them to feel more connected, or develop that sense of community in the classroom that sometimes might be missing. The other comment, you may want to consider, I think those can be interesting comments, but I also worry that students could consider it, but not necessarily act on something. So it's also helpful to see that they are, whether they made the change or not. And if they didn't make a change or didn't consider it, is there a reason why they did not make that change? And that may be something to follow up with them after, because an ongoing assignment or paper, may be helpful to try to follow up to see, if you ask them to consider, the ecological theories, and they don't include ecological theories in the next paper, did they just not have time to do that, or did they not think that was appropriate to include? So in terms of providing this feedback, deep learning is helpful. It can, it can encourage people to really become engaged in critical thinking rather than trying to recall or recognize facts. It's helpful to understanding new ideas. Sometimes it's not always easy to see how to design an assignment to be like this, but so that's sometimes a challenge. It's not necessary for every assignment, but a good course should have some elements that will foster creativity, or more thinking about how these concepts could be applied. Learning activities should also encourage openness of ideas, exchanging ideas, experimenting with different concepts or ideas. this, I think, comes into play a bit more with the peer feedback that people have mentioned, the discussion questions, or responding to other students' notes. All of that helps get the student engaged with their other classmates and helps to build a community. It also helps students to think about different perspectives. If it's the same question about how did the writer provide a conclusion, you might get a lot of the same responses, but there might be enough variety in those responses that people can begin to think about not just the 2 or 3 things they said, but the 4 or 5 other things that other students had provided. So it's a way to really get them exposed to more ideas. And it's also helpful to develop these critical thinking skills or this idea exchange as part of the classroom culture, but also to help the students' professional growth so that they can carry these skills on to the next class. And so if you have a class that encourages a lot of discussion among students, they may initially be shy to provide comments or criticism, but the more experience they have, the more adept or skillful they may become in providing feedback to their peers in future classes. Right, and okay, I see someone noted feedback in a writing class is going to be different than chemistry or biology. All right, so sometimes there are very objective facts. There was no way to necessarily have multiple answers to the correct periodic table formula for different elements or different compositions, but that doesn't mean there isn't the opportunity to provide some feedback on ways to improve, or at the very least providing the correct formula, or in something like chemistry or statistics. It helps to provide feedback so that the students recognize they're making the correct responses. They know what's correct or how to improve, and certainly the nature of the feedback is very different. We'll get into that in a little bit later as well. So I mentioned earlier different types of feedback. Formative is kind of ongoing. It aims to improve the learning process. It provides the student information on what is going well, what needs to improve. And then the summative feedback comes at the end of the class and includes more constructive feedback and the grade for the course. So there are different kinds of feedback based on where which week it is in the course. Next, I'd like to talk about different cognitive and emotional aspects of feedback. So, in terms of just providing, good job, this answer was correct. Feedback can be seen as having these different components related to how the student perceives themselves and the emotional feelings they have about the course. So some common themes include self-efficacy, motivation, and anxiety. So when students know they're doing well, or they know what to do, they can develop a sense of control or mastery of the class, or self-efficacy, and this can motivate learning. So self-efficacy is the belief that one can cope and succeed. If you feel you are very good at history and you can do very well in the course, you have very high self-efficacy for the history course. Or you could feel that you're not, history may not be your best topic, and, do you feel that you can succeed though? Is it going to be a challenge, or is it something, too insurmountable for you to try to achieve? In terms of motivation, this can follow from having, a sense of self-efficacy. These are the factors or influences that relate to someone's desire to do something. Are they going to spend 3 hours revising their history paper for review, or are they going to be motivated to go and spend time with friends or family or other pursuits? So feeling that is a student feeling that they can do very well in the history class is likely to want to put in that extra effort. It's about making the effort to really do well in the class, to understand the material, to apply that material effectively. Then kind of maybe a two-sided sword comes into play with anxiety, and you can think of anxiety as being either facilitating, where it helps people, it motivates them to do well on something, or it could be something the opposite, such as debilitating anxiety, where it interferes with learning itself. So, for example, if you provide facilitating anxiety, that might be something like, well, you have a week left in the class, and you need to know these concepts to get a good grade. Things like that will let the student know, creates this anxiety or tension that they need to know this material in a short amount of time, and they're going to be kind of you're trying to act upon or to master this material so they meet the deadline. So something that kind of encourages you to do well, such as maybe you get a note in the mail that says return this census form within the next 30 days, or and it kind of provides that incentive to do well. The debilitating anxiety is something that kind of goes against motivating students or making them more productive. It might be something like getting a low score, say one part of the assignment that the student overlooked. For example, if the student got a score of 50 points, on this first assignment, do you provide suggestions on how to improve the score, or is it just you got a 50% and does it kind of send the message that you're not going to do very well in this course, and it serves to kind of depress or suppress motivation to do well? So it's really, think about the way that the feedback you give will be interpreted. Is it going to, have that motivating effect, or is it going to kind of, cause someone to, freeze up like a deer in the headlights? Okay, and so before we move on, I'd like to ask a little bit about challenges that you face when delivering feedback. So what kinds of things do you feel you need to you would like to do a better job on, or things that are technical, social, personal, classroom related that happen?
So David hopped off the microphone, so there's a couple of comments that I can read. If you want to take the microphone to speak, you can do that as well. In terms of, Jim puts down that he wants to have his students spend the time learning biology, not learning about his quirks. Jane talks about language barriers. Jim also talks to making sure that you get to every student. And Emma said, as someone mentioned earlier, dealing with the sheer volume of feedback in each course. Jane talks about class size. Jim talks about pointing them in the right direction without giving them answers. So those are some really great challenges that they mentioned, David. Okay, Catherine also talked about she's a big believer in doing peer feedback and small group discussions, especially online, and it helps with the volume of posting for the instructor, and Jim agrees with that.
Right. So, okay. So the peer feedback is very helpful in getting information to the students, but it can also have some challenges involved as well. For example, are the students going to all feel as committed to providing feedback to everyone? Are they going to respond to everyone's post equally? Right, flaming, that can create a hostile classroom environment where people feel things they say might get, criticized, or they might get compared to, something negative. The language issue can be a challenge. Is it a matter of simplifying the feedback, making it more clear, or is it, maybe even trying to translate it? The volume of the class size is certainly, a big challenge. I think I face, and several others have expressed challenges with. It takes a lot of time to provide feedback, and it takes even more time to provide very highly detailed and specific feedback. Just the more personalized the feedback is, the more time commitment it takes from you. So just having standard rubrics, is one thing to read through and provide some grades on the same assignment. But the more detailed you go, the more time it will take. Right, and trying to provide students with a direction, but rather not necessarily the answer, can be a challenge because, you sometimes, one tendency I have is, to try to, maybe use something like the Socratic method where they feel they are you're trying to lead them into finding the conclusion, but they may not necessarily always answer the way that you think they might. So that can be kind of a personal challenge to just, to have the patience to maintain, the questioning or the feedback, or helping them to go in that right direction. Okay. Okay, so there are different ways to provide this feedback, and I think one of the more common ways would be the formal feedback methodology, where you're providing it in the course as part of the formative or summative evaluation, where you're giving a grade, you're giving a notice of how well they're doing, where they need to improve, but it's all kind of documented. You could go back and look at it, a week from now, and find the same information you provided to the student. The other type of feedback is informal feedback, and this is more kind of like on-the-spot comments, referring to the learning process. So it seems like feedback, kind of away from the classroom setting comments. Not necessarily grade-based. So what does that mean? You might, you're right, and this is one of the things that can be more difficult to provide in this online forum, because we don't necessarily get that one-on-one interaction. But things such as providing a note of encouragement, maybe in the personal forum, is not associated with a grade. You're not saying, 5 out of 5 points for the feedback, 5 out of 5 points for the discussion questions and participation this week, but you've, you say things like, oh, I've noticed you've really improved since week 1, and you're doing much better in your level of, participation. Things like that are helpful. So it's not necessarily focused on a grade. It's also helpful to maybe want to check in on students that are not doing very well, and the student's been missing, an assignment or posting late. You might say, oh, are there any questions? Have you been having any difficulties getting classes completed? And I see there's a question. I'll hand over the microphone.
David, Patty has a question, and she wants to know what you meant when you said away from the class setting in an online class when everything's online.
Okay. So, right. So, so I mentioned this, but just to recap, is basically providing notes of encouragement. You're doing a good job. I can tell you're really improving, or answering questions about, students that may be having challenges. They may not necessarily ask for help. They may be struggling to catch up or learn the very basic material. And a lot of the courses material may build each week. It may build from the prior weeks, and so if you miss a few weeks, it can be easy to, for a student to really fall behind. So just kind of checking in to see where they are, and anything you can do to help them is also helpful feedback. One thing that is, another kind of principle of delivering feedback is, provide highly specific feedback. And this has been mentioned by a number of people in this class. Talk about what occurred, less focus on, the student character. It's also helpful to ask for the student's own evaluation, periodically, saying, by asking if the feedback has been useful, how they feel they are doing in the class. Do they feel they are gaining a mastery of the material? Are there areas that are still a challenge to them? Maybe they're still having trouble writing, the formulas, things like that, to see if they understand how well they're doing, what their problem areas happen to be, and if they happen to be the same areas that you see the problem areas to be. So this might be done in a more structured way, maybe asking some specific questions, at maybe a third through the course or halfway through, just to kind of have like a one-on-one feedback session. The other thing is to note that is, with so many students, or sometimes just trying to not be too negative, feedback may come off as being praise. So just saying, great job, may not always, is feedback, but it may not necessarily help to promote learning. So you might say, you did good on part A, of the assignment, but not really say anything about part B, where they missed a lot of the questions or the details. So just letting them know what they did well is part of the process of giving good feedback, but letting them know, how they, where they may need to improve is also helpful. I see someone asked, what if you ask this question to assess their own evaluation and they don't respond? That may happen. Maybe a student is feeling they are, doing as best they can. They don't have any questions, or they don't have any real challenges, or maybe they don't really know how to answer the question. But I think the important thing is just to be able to open the line of communication. If it is, if they choose to respond, that's great. If they choose, not to respond, that might be okay too, as long as they're still kind of making progress. But it is something to kind of keep a note on, or keep an eye on, to see if this does change, or if they do have any more questions, if you can help them. But the valuable thing is just being able to keep this line of communication open. I worry that too many students fear they can't really talk to a faculty or ask a question if something wasn't correct. They may not really know how to ask it. They may just accept it and not really learn from the experience other than they have the question incorrect. Okay, and so there are two types of ways to provide the feedback. The types of information might be quantitative, where you provide a numeric rating on the assignment, and then you could have a qualitative feedback component, which is text-based. And using both can be effective in giving responses to the student about learning practices. But what are students more likely to focus on? Is it this question about you earn 80 out of 100 points, or are they going to focus more on something like make sure the conclusion sentences match the topic and body sentences in the paragraphs? When you send the feedback, what's the number one thing that students look at? It's probably going to be the grade and the score. So, how might you try to encourage people to really focus on, not just the score, but the actual comments? All right, okay, so I see a few questions about, or comments. Students may not really read the rubric. They don't really respond to the things you tell them or comment on. So at some level, that seems like it may be a frustrating experience. You're providing a lot of your time and energy to kind of craft a very unique or detailed response that might help a student learn, but you may not necessarily see the progress they're making, or it may not seem clear that they care that much about the feedback. So I mean, I guess as faculty, how can you manage that frustration? And I mean, is it a goal of feedback that the students should pay attention to everything you say and make all the changes you tell them to? All right, okay, and Jim knows the verbal feedback should come before the the formal summative assessment. Right, but I mean, it can be frustrating at times, and there are not always easy answers to this question about what happens when you feel the student isn't really responding or learning from the feedback. And maybe it takes a more direct approach. Following up with the student. In their forum, if it's area of high concern, making sure that they, read and understood the comment. Because just because something is stated in the rubric doesn't necessarily mean it's understood. The student may not know how to correct or improve upon that comment. Okay. And someone mentioned having students redo a paper in a writing class. Do others allow that? Revised assignments as a way to improve the overall paper? Okay, so I see a few, a few people do use this approach. I noticed somebody, I think it was, or I mentioned that it's required that the students use the feedback to improve. That's something that you can kind of build into the grading process. Having, I've seen this done often with the peer feedback. Having students, first provide the feedback, and then, in a second, assignment, providing a detailed response about how they, which feedback they decided to include or not include from the peer. This tends to work better when there's a lot of variety or opportunity for feedback. It's also helpful to really check in to see if the student's improving or not making the same mistakes when you have, the same paper as a way to gain mastery of the topic. In delivering feedback, you have to think about your objective. Is it going to be the first draft or the final version of the paper? And, if it's a first draft, you want to really focus on, maybe you make the feedback very detailed and specific, or maybe you want to go with a very broad approach, and then focus in on, the second draft, focus a bit more on those finer points of the assignment. So doing a one-time assignment, it's easy to maybe think about providing, less feedback, in the initial assignment, just providing some general feedback. But it's also helpful to try to mix it up and, make some specific comments. So, if you state, the conclusion doesn't always follow in the text, try to provide a specific area or example of that. Sometimes in giving feedback, this works well in personal situations, but it can also be used effectively in classroom settings, is to deliver, both, if you have some negative information to provide, try to include both positive and negative aspects in your response back to the student on the assignment. Stating you did well on the sentence construction, but you need to focus more on the analysis to make it more, concrete or more specific, and then try to follow up with a more positive example. So this is an approach that's helpful or been recommended for students with, who are struggling in the class, or maybe novices in the classroom. The feedback can help. A more advanced student may not need this approach as much. You might be able to just kind of give feedback a bit more directly, but it's also something to think about. In terms of your overall comments, are you including something positive, and if you have something negative, how are they balanced? I'm going to move on a few slides more. In terms of the delivery, and we've talked a bit about some of these challenges, but as faculty, you might face conflicting demands with teaching, multiple classes, and they may all have the same deadline for a big assignment. At the finals week, that can present some challenges. and just giving your own time to this. Interruptions in the course, for example, if you have a substitute come in for a week, or if there's a break in the class or a holiday vacation, that can sometimes influence the way feedback is delivered or how it's remembered from week to week. It may take a little bit of time to get used to delivering some negative feedback. You may want the students to give you a positive evaluation at the end of the course, but you don't want to say anything too negative, so that can sometimes hold you back. But there are always constructive or positive ways to frame something. Something that's come up a few times is a student expressing issues with needing to get a certain grade level to pass the class or to maintain their scholarship, and the role of the faculty is is it to make sure that student gets their scholarship met, or is it to provide more honest feedback, and that can create some tough dilemmas as well. And again, think about the interpretation of the student and how they will see the feedback that you provide. And is it going to be the same feedback you intend it to be? And this can be done by sometimes just following up to see if they have any questions on the responses you provided. Okay, so I see a few comments about the issue of the scholarship, noting that is up to the the faculty to really toe the line and be fair on grading something. So kind of to talk about the effectiveness of feedback. How do you know if feedback is working? Okay, so I saw a response, looking at feedback effectiveness, look for a change in the output. That might be the volume, perhaps, if a student is noted as not providing enough content, do they increase that the amount of content they provide? Are they providing, are they going from a C score to a B score?
I think the other thing too is that, like, I've had problems, David. I don't know how you would deal with that, but I've given lots of great feedback, and I've asked the students, why didn't you do that in your next paper? And they told me that it was not worth the trouble to do it, that they'd rather have the reduced letter grade. So they know what they're doing is wrong. They just don't care to take the time to fix what they need to earn a better grade.
Okay, so one thing that might be helpful, and I think Jim mentioned it, is asking them to show examples of how they've changed. One thing that I find useful to kind of consider is thinking about comparing the first half or the first third of the class to and the points or the average grade the student has obtained to the second half or the second third of the class, to see if are students improving. How many students had a 80%, if a student had an 80% grade in part 1 of the class, does that improve to 90% in the second part? Just the grade for that second half of the class. Or is the student going from an 80 to maybe a 60% in the second half? And what kind of information that provides you might be very telling. Even though the assignments are going to be different in the first and second half of the class, just getting a general sense of students and how they're doing percentage-wise can be helpful. It may be that some students kind of drop off their level of interest in the second part of the class, and you can begin to see this over time gradually, but it's also helpful to kind of pick a defined point or month period and really look to see how what that score was at time 1 compared to what it is at time 2. And so if feedback doesn't lead to a change, is it still successful? So if you don't see an improvement or a change, the student is still struggling or not making any improvement, what does that mean? And so one thing that research has looked at is feedback, focusing on whether the feedback improves learning, in terms of a numeric response or the quality of the writing, but also how it improves learning. And so just because the feedback, you may not see the change you hope to see, that doesn't mean a change isn't happening. Or it may take the student a little bit longer to really understand the ideas to be fully successful. So just because you're not seeing all the wonderful changes and improvements doesn't mean the feedback isn't having an effect. The student could be, learning to really focus on the incentives, the motivation to improve their learning process. They might be comparing this information to their past classes or their past responses to see how they've improved. And it helps them to really develop this internal schemata to help analyze their own learning process. So even if they keep making the same mistake, if they learn that or they keep seeing the same feedback about that mistake, it begins to kind of really focus in on, this might be how I might improve my overall score. Okay, so I'm running near the end of the session. There are a couple other topics we can go into detail in the more on the other course, and that would include things around more of what we've talked about, going into that in more detail. Focus on how to use peer feedback and how effective it has been. Creating the right classroom culture that would encourage learning. So kind of to review everything we've been thinking about or talking about, and we want to thank all of you for all of your great ideas. I've seen a lot of good ideas and suggestions, wonderful points made by everyone. So glad everyone was able to attend it, and I hope people were able to share and exchange knowledge and kind of grow from this experience and maybe try to use a few new techniques in their own approach to providing feedback. So kind of, just kind of a review of, what do an open mic or open text, what do you consider to be successful feedback? What do you think about when you give feedback, and what in your own experience, what feedback has been given to you, or how has feedback been given to you that has been very valuable? Okay, so I saw a comment about the personal and academic feedback. It's both important to think about the student as a student and the student as a person, and I think both taking that point of view can also be very helpful. It can get at some of those self-efficacy and motivation factors we talked about in the earlier part of the discussion.